Hey everyone, it's Lexie. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you kind of my fall reading recommendations. So I don't know about you, but I think there is something about reading in fall that I don't know what it is, but with books that I really like to read in fall, they have to be very atmospheric. I think also because I always associate fall with like cold, crisp days with kind of like the bluey, like the dark blue gray sky and just being cold, and I just consider it to be very atmospheric. So that's what I kind of look for when I'm reading books. So what I have here is kind of 5 books that I think would be really neat to read during fall. Some of them have, like all these books I did find to be very atmospheric, and they kind of all describe times when it's cold. So like cold, like kind of fall times, and one of them's in winter, but whatever. But basically these are kind of like my top fall reading recommendations. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first book that I have is kind of a thriller that I read over the summer, and it is Meanstreak by Sandra Brown. I really love this book. It follows a doctor who is training for a marathon, so she ends up spending like a weekend in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina, and she goes out for a run and she wakes up with a pounding headache and like a head injury and a concussion in some stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere. She's not sure what's going on, who hit her, like does she trust this man, because this man has no identification, he won't tell her name, he's living off the grid, and it kind of goes off from there. So this book was really interesting. It is a quick thriller, so like the chapters are really quick and they always end on kind of a cliffhanger, so it keeps you really going. And also it does take place in winter, but it kind of is getting you ready for winter in a sense. But the author does like a really good job of like describing like cabins and like having a fireplace and like cozy socks. So I think this one is really good, and it's a book that keeps you on the edge of your seat. I know I did, and I did not guess who the killer was, and it just blew me away. So I highly recommend that you check this book out, and I think it is just an awesome fall read. Next, I have The Forgotten Garden by Kate Morton, and this is another book that actually all these books except 2 I read over the summer, and this follows kind of like a dual storyline, but I think that again this book is very atmospheric, and I'll tell you why in a second. But basically it tells the story of a woman named Nell who on her 20th birthday her parents kind of tell her that she is not in fact their biological daughter. She was found kind of a barge with no parents in a suitcase from a boat that came from Australia, so like when she was like 3 or 4, so kind of her adopted parents took her in, and this shakes Nell's world upside down. She kind of never recovered from that, so when she's a little bit older, like in her 60s, her father gives her a suitcase that she had and with a kind of fairy tale book. So Nell tries to seek out who her family was, and so it kind of flashes back following the story of Liza, who is a young woman taking place in like the early 1900s in London, whose life kind of intertwines with Nell's. And what I think this book also is within like the top 5 of my most favorite books ever, but it is also very atmospheric. Later on it kind of describes like the English coast and just how cold they like live in. Like there's this mansion in particular that's by the sea and all that stuff, and I think it had that total like fall feel for me. Like it was just really atmospheric, and it takes place over the course of several like years, so like you do get all the seasons, but I feel for the most part it's kind of like in the colder months. So I think this is a perfect autumn like read with like a cup of tea or hot chocolate and like by the fire with like wool socks. It would be perfect. So this is like a book that came first to mind in terms of kind of like atmospheric fall, and it is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. So I read this book over the summer and I loved it. I can't believe it took me so long to read it, but basically it takes place in the mid 1800s, and it follows basically, I think the only thing you need to know about it is that there is a night circus that will come up at night at one place, stay there for like a week or two and then disappear the next day. And while this is going on, there is kind of like a duel between two magicians, and I think that's all you kind of need to know about this plot going into it. I think it's best to go into it blind. But what's really amazing about this book is how atmospheric it is. Just, I could taste the food that it describes, like I could smell the carnival and all of that stuff. So I think this book is a perfect like fall read, hands down. It was just really amazing, and I think they also kind of talk about like the brisk nights and all that, and just kind of like the air and the smell. Like I could smell everything, so I think this is perfect to read during this season. Next, I have Still Life by Louise Penny, and this is a first book in the Inspector Gamache series, and it basically follows a story of Detective Gamache, who is from Quebec, from Montreal, and he ends up on like over Thanksgiving weekend, he ends up getting called to this town called Three Pines, where a kind of elderly beloved woman of the town is found shot with an arrow, and they like police just think it is just like a very tragic hunting accident, but Inspector Gamache thinks there's more to this woman's death that meets the eye. And the author of this did such an amazing job of describing this town. It kind of had a kind of Stars Hollow feel to it, which I really enjoyed, but like just in terms of it being, because it does take place over like Canadian Thanksgiving weekend, which is in October, which is like perfect time for fall, but basically that's like how I kind of see it, and just how it was described, like just in terms of the atmosphere and just kind of the all like mystery of it too. I didn't really get like this one as well, I didn't guess who was the actual kind of killer in it, so it kept me on the edge of my seat, and I think this is the perfect fall read. And finally, this is the first, like probably one of the top books I've read last year, and it was The Bone Garden by Tess Gerritsen, and this is kind of like another dual storyline that does take place in kind of like fall October. So it follows a woman named Julie who ends up moving into this old like house that was built in the 1800s, and she's kind of doing some yard work in the garden where she stumbles upon this body, like this skeleton that's been buried there for almost 200 years. So while that's being investigated, Julie kind of wants to learn more about the woman who lived there and why this body be there, like why was their body buried in her garden. So the story kind of flashbacks to Boston during the 1800s, and just it follows a woman named Rose who is kind of, after her sister dies in childbirth, she has to take care of her child. While this is going on, there is a series of very gruesome murders taking place, and she ends up crossing paths with this medical student, and who's kind of been employed by the university because he cannot pay his tuition to kind of dig up fresh bodies, and their stories kind of intertwine. So this book I really loved. It was just in terms of how the author really describes Boston during this time, and just like the fog and the chill, I think it is perfect to read during this time of year. I ended up going to Boston, like that was like one of like the places I really wanted to go see over the summer, so it's nice to kind of see what that, like I know what Boston looks like now, and just how historical that city is, and just kind of taking what I know now and just transposing it into how the author describes Boston during this time was just amazing. And I think if you kind of like historical fiction with like suspense and like murder mystery, I think this is the perfect book for you. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below what some of your favorite fall books are, and so yeah, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you guys next time. Bye, guys.